Hello, this is Jeffrey Tucker from the Brownstone Institute, and it's my pleasure to be here with Michael Senger, who is the author of Snake Oil.
Snake oil.
And yeah, snake oil. Oh, good. Hold it up right there. That works. That
Yes,
works.
sir.
And I'm so mortified to tell you that and you probably knew this already, that I hadn't read it for a very long time. I'm reading it now.
Great.
When you and I have been chasing the same story now for 2 years. But the thing that a lot of people overlook, which is the role of CCP and promoting lockdowns, and I have a lot of very interesting questions about that. In fact, people have been urging us to do this for a while because they seem to think that you and I have different stories to tell, or overlapping but different in some ways. I just don't know about that. But
I think the differences can be exaggerated often. I think, we see eye to eye on, 99% of what's gone on. It's really just the sort of motivations behind it. And sometimes the differences can be a bit exaggerated when you go into that level of detail. But
so I hope to get to that, and don't want to keep you too long, but I would like to, if you don't mind, just plunge into the big news, although it's not being covered, as best I can tell, which is the Shanghai lockdowns. And I'm wondering, are you following them, and what is your read of the situation?
Yeah, one of many facts that is, completely destructive to the narrative that we've been told the last 2 years, which is, we've been implementing all these mandates largely on the idea that that China was successful in sort of eliminating this virus from their entire country because they're, locked out of Wuhan and all their mandates were so stunningly effective. Of course, all complete nonsense when you actually look at any of the underlying data, but the narrative has been so tightly controlled the entire time that, very few people actually go and question that. But, the Shanghai lockdown is devastating to that. What are the motivations behind that, the specific motivations behind that? I don't think anybody outside the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, which is, of course, notoriously secretive, selected for that specific trait of being so capable of keeping secrets, and also the leadership of the city of Shanghai, which sometimes, a lot of overlap there with the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, but not completely. So, I think we can really only speculate as to what are the particular motivations behind that, but there's a few points that I think are important to discuss with that lockdown, which, the lockdown itself is obviously real, and it's a really big deal. As others have pointed out, Shanghai is, the financial capital of all of modern China. It's even bigger than Wuhan. This is a very, very big lockdown, devastating for China's economy, and obviously for the city of Shanghai and its residents as well. So this is very real, even if, the policy itself from the very beginning with Wuhan was largely theater. So then why are they doing it? The first answer is that beginning with the lockdown of Wuhan, the Chinese Communist Party, beginning from the very top with Xi Jinping, conjured into the world this idea of a super virus, this sort of pseudo reality that there is this super virus out there that you can control with all these totalitarian mandates, from lockdowns and mass mandates to mass testing and vaccine passes, that was the only way to control this novel super virus coming out of Wuhan. And although that narrative is just complete science fiction, and when you actually dig into the details, complete nonsense, the idea that there was this super virus that you could eliminate from an entire country with their strict lockdown of Wuhan, the welding people into their doors, who knew that after all these centuries, welding people in was the secret to controlling a virus? Complete nonsense science fiction narrative, but that's also a pseudo reality that they had to live by themselves and pretend was true for 2 years. And that sort of blending of fantasy with reality, of science fiction with reality, goes back really to the very beginning of the Chinese Communist Party. That's something that they do all the time within the Chinese Communist Party and within North Korea and other communist countries as well. It's just sort of event reality, and really the line between reality and fantasy, the fantasy of what the leadership insists is true is not, becomes very blurred, especially with the more authoritarian, totalitarian leaders like Mao and like Xi Jinping as we have now. So that's the first one, is that the leadership is really, they have to pretend that the pseudo reality of a super virus is real, whether or not they actually believe it. And so the entire rank and file of the party has to follow the line. The other point is, the biggest thing that the party wants to ensure with having exported all these mandates to the rest of the world is that they're able to get away with it and people don't catch on. And so far, they've been pretty successful in doing that. I have been sort of pursuing this narrative doggedly, the connection between the Chinese Communist Party and these mandates for 2 years. But I, Michael P. Senger, am not the FBI. I am not a major political official. I alone am not going to be able to do this myself as much as might like to. So in that sense, so far the Chinese Communist Party, to the extent that they have influenced these mandates all over the world, there hasn't really been a lot of resistance to it. And it looks like they might actually be able to get away with that in some sense. And so this lockdown of Shanghai, as real as it is economically, it is very sort of useful theater in that sense of showing, oh yeah, we really believe this narrative. This is something that, we're really, look, we just locked down one of our even larger cities. This is something that, the fact that, we even have to ask, does that mean that it wasn't a psychological operation, that it wasn't just theater to be exported to the rest of the world? That shows how useful this is in, proving that the Chinese Communist Party is still attached to that narrative. And the third point is that, in much of the world, especially in liberal states and countries, they still have not denounced these mandates. They're still pretending that they were very effective in, stopping this virus. So they're still, bought into the super virus narrative to some extent. So it remains to be seen when respiratory virus season comes back and when cases start increasing again, whether we'll be right back where we started and they start importing these mandates all over again.
When you look at the data from Worldometer or whatever, and look up at China, it's a long period of 2 years with a huge spike on this side, a long flat line, complete elimination,
right,
of the bad bug from clean, wonderful, perfect China, but now you're seeing reporting on this side with, I suppose it represents the Shanghai outbreak. What is your view about what happened in between these numbers? I had been convinced that the entire thing was a big phony baloney, that SARS-CoV-2 was probably spreading all over China, and there just wasn't any testing, any reporting, that it was like a state mandate to have zero COVID. But then something seemed to have broken. I mean, first of all, is that true? And if that is true, does the recent spike suggest that the flat thing is real, or was? Well, I'm not even sure how it came about. The discovery of cases in Shanghai, were they constantly testing? Well, let me just stop there, and you could answer my narrative right there.
Well, it was all data fraud. I mean, this idea that the Chinese Communist Party, their lockdown of Wuhan was, they had this super lockdown and it was so successful that it eliminated the virus from all of China. So you had this flat landing in China. But of course, every single country around China, this big porous border of the most populous country in the world, they all have cases at all-time highs. It's obvious nonsense, and it's just been data fraud from the very beginning. So where did they finally have this? How did they now have this spike in cases? Well, the first thing to note is that they've had these little spikes in cases in various cities around China for the past 2 years now and then they say, they implemented another lockdown and eliminated it. This just happens to be the biggest one. And what is the sort of motivation behind that? I think it goes back to, what I was saying previously, that they're still pretending that this narrative is true. I think a lot of the rank and file are still testing and still pretending that there is a super virus out there that they have to test for and get under control whenever it arises. So, it's definitely safe to say that a huge portion of the population of China really does believe in this COVID narrative, that, they really do think that China was successful in eliminating this virus, as much as that is, objectively just simply not true and simply fraudulent. So where did this big spike in cases in Shanghai recently come from? It could simply be a result of the rank and file, testing and doing their usual testing. And then when they found some cases, they, increased that number of tests and, suddenly they're freaking out like, oh, we found all these cases. And so, I mean, who knows exactly how that bureaucracy within the Chinese Communist Party is working. They can't, the Chinese Communist Party is too big and the lie is too nuanced for them to, sit down and explain, for the leadership to sit down and explain with every single member of the Chinese Communist Party that, this is a lie, it's fraud, but you have to pretend it's true. No, they can't do it that way. Only the grandmaster liars at the very top can, acknowledge that among themselves. But the other rank and file of the Chinese Communist Party, they just have to tell them it's true, and you have to, every aspect of this is true, and you have to believe it, or at least pretend to, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, so some public health officials is running tests. Somebody comes in and says, look, we've found some positive tests, and we're finding more. Suddenly it's radio Beijing, we've got an outbreak in Shanghai. Then it's, okay, we got to crack down. Let's do another a lockdown.
Another big lockdown, yeah. So suddenly all the theater becomes very real. Now that said, an important point there is that suddenly you have, in Shanghai, you have this big surge of tens of thousands of cases. You have the entire city in lockdown. However, China still has yet to report any COVID deaths since that original surge in Wuhan. So the data fraud is still obviously there. Is this the graph I captured on the cover of my book here? This is the short spike of COVID deaths in China when you had the original outbreak in Wuhan. And of course, the order comes down from the top to simply eliminate that. So just flat line from there on out. And that flat line is still going today. They are still reporting essentially zero COVID deaths throughout all of China, despite the announcement that they have tens of thousands of cases within Shanghai and the lockdown there. So it's still very obvious data fraud that we're getting out of the Chinese Communist Party. And so why are they having this big lockdown now? I think we'll only be able to know in hindsight.
What's the vaccination situation in China? I know they have their own vaccine, not based on mRNA technology, but is there a campaign to get everybody vaccinated?
There is. Surprisingly, the vaccination rate in China is actually surprisingly low, especially amongst older people, as several publications and liberal publications have noted. They do have very strict vaccine mandates, very strict vaccine pass system. However, China is still in many ways a developing country, and in a lot of the developing world, the campaign to get the entire population vaccinated has really not been as successful, simply because a large portion of the population in countries like China and other developing countries is not that tied into the modern sort of information economy, and they just don't really understand why they would. China, and as you said, China has yet to give anybody these mRNA vaccines, which have been the standard throughout the rest of the world, especially the developed world. They originally bought millions and millions of doses of these mRNA vaccines back in early 2021, along with the rest of the world, and have yet to actually distribute any of them, which is kind of ironic. It shows how little trust the leadership of the CCP, whether rationally or not, actually has in these mRNA vaccines that have been, not only distributed widely by governments in the rest of the world, but even mandated into the rest of the world to even participate in society in the most basic ways.
I also understand that there seems to be a popular resentment against or suspicion of Western medicine generally in China, is my read on the situation. Like, it's one of the reasons the U.S. patent law has not been able to go anywhere in China, despite endless amounts of hectoring and so on, is that they're worried that the patents would, in effect, claim patents over their traditional therapeutics and medicines, which is very possible, actually, given the sort of hegemonic ambitions of the pharmaceutical companies. So that might have played a role here, too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the vaccine companies, Pfizer, Moderna, that really spearheaded these mRNA vaccines, although they're very cozy with the Chinese Communist Party leadership. Many would say too cozy. And who knows? We can only speculate as to what exactly role that played between the vaccine companies and the Chinese Communist Party over the world's response to COVID in the last 2 years. That said, a lot of the population of China is very skeptical of this strange technology, which I think everybody is a little skeptical of at some level, this mRNA technology. And those are, ultimately Western American companies that have really spearheaded this technology. And so I think a lot of the population of China is skeptical of it. And that probably includes the leadership, given that they haven't actually distributed any of these mRNA vaccines within the country. They do see it as a Western technology.
We're kind of backing into this subject I want to ultimately land on, which is the early days of the pandemic. But let's take a little tour through the lab leak issue, because early on in the pandemic, I think you dropped me a note and said something like, I'm watching your post and I don't see you sort of jumping on this lab leak thing. Why is that? And my answer, which I think you liked, was that I said my concern is that this plays into part of the sort of the otherization of this virus. The perception that we've never seen anything like this, that it's got unusual properties that defy all textbook normalcy of a seasonal pathogens. It's not like any other coronavirus we've ever seen, and so therefore that's the reason to lock down and panic and freak out and throw away everything we know about viruses for this one. And that was my concern about this lab leak thing. And I think you said that was your worry about it too. In the meantime, you developed, I think in your book, a theory that the lab leak theory itself was itself a leak, in the sense that China, this Communist Party, wanted people to believe that it was a lab leak. Am I characterizing your? Yeah. So what's fascinating about this, and by the way, let's just be clear, neither you or I know either way. I mean, I read these papers, it's a leak, it's not a leak. Oh, here's here's the, this thing and that thing. Here's this sequence, that sequence. I can't understand any of it. So right. I have no real opinion on it. But what's intriguing to me about this is how much the fear that this is a lab leak, and especially given the sketchy funding sources and the role of Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance and Fauci's own interest in gain of function research and all this stuff, seems to have, in my read on the situation, seems to have played some really big role in the Western response to this in February. That, I mean, I've not seen anything to contradict this idea, and a lot of emails and testimony from Jeremy Farrar, who says this in his book, that they were 80% certain it was a lab leak. And if that's true, that means it's either accidental or deliberate. If it's deliberate, we've got World War III. If it's accidental, they're in a whole lot of trouble simply because of their role here. So the perception that it was a lab leak seems to have really weighed very heavily on Farrar and Collins, Daszak, and Farrar throughout the whole month of February, and might have, and I can't prove this, played some role in causing them to pursue these wild lockdown strategy of disease mitigation. And I think we're discovering this more and more. So how does that impact on your thesis? Does it shake it at all? Does it add a footnote to it, or does it reinforce it?
I mean, I think it does reinforce it. I mean, that's, there's no question that you go back to the communications of early 2020 and, all the way back in late January, early February 2020, you started seeing the national security community get very concerned about the possibility of a super virus lab leak. And as you were saying, you go back to communications between Fauci and Jeremy Farrar and the gang, and they all think that the lab leak is a serious possibility, and they're freaking out about it. And, that's the key point, is that if it wasn't for this idea that there could have been a lab leak of a super virus, the world simply would not have shut down early 2020. That's the key point that I don't think, quite enough people grasp, is that this lab leak, this idea that it at least could have been a lab leak, was absolutely crucial to the shutdown of the world in early 2020. Why do I think that the Chinese Communist Party played a role in actually disseminating that idea that it could have been a lab leak? Well, it just goes back to the entire way that we found out about this virus. Everything about that initial narrative that we were getting out of Wuhan in early 2020 was very suggestive of a lab leak. Going back to the original decision by Xi Jinping and leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to shut down Wuhan. Why Wuhan of all the cities in China? It just happens to be the site of China's top virology lab. That in itself is kind of suggestive of a lab leak. Then, the next thing you have is all these videos that come out of China, distributed all over the world, all over social media, all over the world, seen by pretty much everybody who uses social media around the world, of people, suddenly falling dead in Wuhan and having these seizures and, just piles of bodies everywhere. I mean, come on. Like, that suggests a lab leak too.
Stepping over dead bodies in the street.
Yeah. And of course, every single one of those is, proven to be fake. These were all fake videos that were coming out. Carefully edited videos. Obviously very suggestive of a lab leak as well. And then you have this story about Li Wenliang, the hero whistleblower, blowing a whistle on this super virus that came out of Wuhan. And, that when you just go back and look at some of the photographs and you look at where that story originated, it turns out actually originated in the Chinese Communist Party's own propaganda outlets, Beijing Youth Daily. That turns out to be fake as well. Every single aspect of this, and some of the actual tweets that were sharing these fake videos coming out of Wuhan, explicitly said, "Is this an intentionally leaked bioweapon coming out of Wuhan?" I mean, it's not even subtle that they were trying to suggest this idea of a lab leaked bioweapon, and the national security community bought into that. You go back and look at what China hawks around that time were saying. Tom Cotton and Mike Pompeo, were discussing, and there were articles about them discussing how this could be a super virus lab leak. And then you have things coming out now that, people are looking into how this decision about lockdowns was made. In Germany, you have some biosecurity lobbyists, biosecurity nonprofits telling people, okay, we're gonna need to shut everything down, communications about how, they thought it might be a lab leak. And so we're going to have lockdowns now. So all that kind of went into action. And the amount of fear that caused, I think a lot of folks, especially on the sort of political left, they don't want to say that they think it might be a lab leak. There's this idea in the political left that's sort of, that's anti-Chinese, and, so we won't say it out loud. But the fact is, I think everybody, it's kind of in their back of the mind, sort of, what if this is this bioweapon? What if this is this lab leak? And actually polls, it's still considered this sort of edgy conspiracy theory in some ways that it could be a lab leak. But polls show that the majority of Americans do believe that the virus came from a lab. So it's actually not, this sort of edgy theory. I think from the very beginning, somehow the idea of a lab leak and the anti-lockdown movement got sort of conflated. And so folks who are really into the lab leak theory, even the ones who support lockdowns, and actually many of the folks who are most advocate the lab leak theory most, are actually very passionate about lockdowns and vaccine mandates. So, even want, people punished as criminals for opposing vaccine mandates. I mean, some of them are, the most vocal COVID nutcases you could say of all.
Yeah. So, let's think about the timing here, because I'm just going to make this up and say there's like April or May, something like that, 2020, when we started hearing talk. Am I right about this? Talk about the possibility, that this is a lab leak. I think before then,
we heard about it much earlier. We heard about it really as soon as Wuhan Lockdown. You started reading.
Right? But when did they have the wet market? Because at some point, I think maybe in the middle of March, I'm pretty sure I heard the person on the street talk about how we need to shut down these wet markets.
It was around February 2020. That's when we started. The Chinese Communist Party, Chinese scientists submitted to global science journals a bunch of stuff about how they come from pangolins in a wet market. And so it sort of cleverly, pretending that they didn't want people to think that the official party line was that, no, it didn't come from our lab, or that would never happen, with our perfect lab security and everything. So that was the official line that's coming out of diplomats. And that's what they submitted to science journals that, it came from this wet market with pangolins, that was 10 miles from the lab. It's ludicrous, and it was meant from the very beginning to be ludicrous. It's about introducing absurdity into global discourse, because now you have people who believe are too woke to, say that they think it came from a lab. Now they say they think it came from a pangolin 10 miles from the lab. And that just makes them sound even more absurd than the folks who are saying it came from a lab. Really, neither source is credible. That we actually have plenty of information now showing that this virus is spreading long before early 2020. It was not the super virus that emerged in Wuhan in early 2020 and caused everybody to suddenly fall to their deaths and have these seizures and everything. We have evidence that, from Spain, that it was, in sewage and spring of 2019, I think, in Spain. And you look at the just death rates from seasonal respiratory viruses throughout Asia, it's clear that there was a surge in respiratory virus deaths all across Asia in early 2019, or even as early as late 2018. And so there did seem to be a strong indication that is when COVID-19 actually began spreading across Asia. And also, there was a massive surge in orders for PCR tests within China in spring of 2019 as well. So that's a good, at least 8 months to a year before the events of Wuhan. So this idea of a lab leak is in early 2020 is somewhat nonsense. The idea that it came from a pangolin 10 miles from the lab is obviously even more nonsense. Really, neither is true. It just started somewhere in Asia. And suddenly you have this lockdown of Wuhan with the great... Xi Jinping saving everybody, saving the day by welding everybody in their homes.
There does seem to be this sort of ex nihilo, the virus leaked out, now it's infecting everybody in Wuhan, and people are dead on the streets, so they lock down. And then, and yet we know, you didn't mention the U.S., but I think, aren't we pretty sure that we had, I'm not sure how we know this, but that SARS-CoV-2 was present in the U.S. in the late fall of 2019.
Correct, in late fall 2019. So we know it was spreading by, at the very latest fall of 2019 within the United States. Really, it seemed to have spread to some extent around the world much earlier than that, and sometime in early 2019. So, it's this very contrived narrative that you had this super virus that suddenly started in Wuhan. Does all this, necessarily negate that it came from a lab? I mean, not necessarily. It could have come from a lab in late 2018 or early 2019. It just seriously limits the meaningfulness of that narrative.
Right.
And that's why I get so frustrated by this idea of the lab leak, which, many of my own followers, my own readers, think that, Michael, you're so hawkish about the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, this seems like a hawkish narrative. Why wouldn't you be all in on this?
Right.
Well, because I think it's just logical absurdity. This is just logical absurdity that in many ways has been deliberately promoted by the Chinese Communist Party within global discourse.
Right.
It can't, when we know the virus started long before the events of early 2020, that just makes lab leak much less meaningful. What they're trying to say is that, there was this super virus and the Chinese Communist Party either deliberately let it out in early 2020 or, covered it up in early 2020. And then, I guess the dictator of China with the super lockdown, welded everybody in, and so China didn't have to deal with it. The rest of the world did. It reinforces this idea that there is this super virus out there, and that the dictator of China, had a reason to weld everybody into their homes. Really, no, there was no real reason to do that. He did it simply because he's a dictator, and that's what dictators do. And he could have done it to any city, any time. And in my mind, I think a big part of the reason he chose Wuhan was because there was a lab there.
Well, this is getting to be a very interesting story in my own head here. Like, to map it out here. So you've got sometime in early mid-January 2020, Farrar and Fauci are burning up the telephone, panicked about a lab leak. To get together their friends for this now famous February 1st meeting. I forget now their names. I'm so bad at names, but who ended up being the co-authors of the paper that appears in Nature on March 17th, but a draft of which is already posted online on February 4th, 3 days after the Zoom call. The one that has all sorts of fancy fireworks and things, proving for sure that it wasn't a lab leak. A paper later that came under severe criticism. So if the story you're telling is right, is correct, I mean, so this is just seasonal pathogen comes along as a mutation of SARS-CoV-1. Chinese Communist Party uses this thing in this theatric presentation of lockdowns.
Yep.
That panics Farrar and Fauci, who are basically responsible for, at some level, going around U.S. law and through a third-party co-health alliance and funding gain-of-function research. So now they're super worried, that, oh my God, our gain-of-function has produced this creepy virus that's now unleashed on the world. Look what's happening in Wuhan. So they can concoct a fake paper to refute the fake theory.
That's exactly, yeah. I mean, that's really exactly what happened. Everybody who's researched this story closely knows that, Fauci is really not an especially honest or ethical guy. And, his interests are a bit different from, the Chinese Communist Party itself. He buys into this narrative and gets, even more freaked out than I think most people would, because he knows that it implicates him and his work sort of directly. So when he sees the dictator of China shut down Wuhan, and he sees all these fake videos coming out, and he hears that, the National Security Committee is worried about a lab leak, I mean, he's even more freaked out than they are, and so, and in his own sort of dishonest fashion, and him and rest of Farrar and his gang, they concoct this paper that oh no, it didn't come from the lab leak. And while they're obviously very worried that it did, but they say this is the science, it did not come from this lab. So as you said, they concoct this fake paper to refute this theory that was in itself a fake concoction to begin with.
So it's a little like Watergate in the sense that, third-rate burglary becomes, the problem of cover-up, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything that's happened for the last 2 years since those initial lockdowns in 2020 has very much been a cover-up. I think you're right in saying that, Fauci and his ilk were much more supportive of shutting down their respective countries because they thought it might come from a lab. And of course, once you shut down the entire world, this initial fear that there was a super virus out of Wuhan, now you're complicit in it. You destroyed, millions and millions of lives.
That's right.
In my mind, the greatest, crime that we've experienced this century. And from that point on, you can't just admit, oh, oops, we did that for nothing. They have to believe that there's a super virus out there. And that's been the impetus for really all the mandates.
Which is a very interesting way to think about it. I mean, I think this is correct. I'm totally willing to change my mind based on the evidence here. But so far, my sense is that Fauci, Farrar, and Collins, and so on, were so panicked themselves so much that by middle of February, they were grasping for straws on what to do to keep themselves from being found out. for their gain of function funding of the Wuhan lab that allegedly leaked the virus, and that lockdowns seemed to them the best, even if, because the truth is that Fauci was never quite part of that sort of lockdown crowd. There's a crowd out there that's been pushing lockdowns for the better part of 15 years, but he was never really part of it. He was much more, had a foot in sort of traditional public health. Even if he's got gazillion problems, but he was never really a lockdowner. In fact, he was making statements, I think, in early February that sounded more or less reasonable, like, well, we'll get through this. It's going to be a bad flu, that sort of thing, but not really talking lockdowns. And so that he went to the lockdown idea, became a champion of it, and the entire suite of MPIs, from constant dousing yourself with hand sanitizer to plexiglass to triple masking it, whatever the hell.
Yep. Suddenly it's just pro mandate, any mandate.
Anything to bullies people. And that it was driven by, at least in my own thinking, for what it's worth, a kind of, I guess you would say, a sincere belief that the less human interaction you have, the fewer cases you're going to have and the fewer deaths, and therefore the less trouble he'll get into. Now, he must have surely known that this is kicking the can down the road, although even that's not clear because SARS-CoV-1 in 2003 flared up, killed a lot of people, and then went away and then didn't go anywhere. And sometimes the World Health Organization takes credit for that. I'm not sure exactly what they did but there was a perception that viruses are suppressible, because SARS-CoV-1 apparently was suppressed. So Fauci might have believed that.
Yeah, maybe. I think it's hard to tell with a guy like Fauci, just, his level of dishonesty throughout the last 2 years, and even before that, going all the way back to the AIDS crisis. It's hard to tell what that guy believes and what not. And so what is his motivation behind these mandates? As you said, early 2020, before the lockdowns, he expressed a lot of skepticism about mandates. Mass mandates, that's nonsense. That won't work.
Right.
School closures, there's temptation to do something.
Even travel restrictions, that's dumb. We don't want those things.
This is all nonsense. This is so dumb. And then, of course, the switch flips in March 2020, and him and a lot of his counterparts, they never go back. Suddenly, no mandate is, ever too many. It's just mandates, and nothing else. And what is his motivation behind that? I think a lot of it is, comes back to once you've endorsed those lockdowns, you can't go back. It's got to be, having done something that big and that destructive, you got to keep doubling down because the alternative that you cause all that destruction for nothing is just too awful. Yeah. Is there some other influence there? In my mind, a lot of these guys have ties to China and the Chinese Communist Party. And, that narrative, I think the biggest, promoter of this narrative that there's a super virus that you can suppress with all these mandates, frankly, it originates with China and with the Chinese Communist Party. So folks who have close careers ties to them, you look across the board, people who have, close ties to China have to, pretend to believe this narrative about mandates and about how China's response was successful. They are sort of among Westerners the most likely to sort of endorse that. And you see this throughout the entire federal government. I think it was the interview. There was an interview, I think it was NPR. They had Martin Kulldorff, the really to be honest, who's been on our side opposing these mandates. And they had Rochelle Walensky shortly before she became director of the CDC saying that, saying, the United States did so awful. And, as a comparison, China was able to eliminate this virus and keep their, cases, never had more than, 3,000 cases or deaths or whatever. And that shows you what a really, really strict lockdown, what they did in Wuhan was true. I mean, that's terrifying. This is the director of the CDC endorsing this narrative and this data that is just obviously fraudulent. And, they're very kind of secretive about it. They don't really tell the public this, But frankly, I mean, that has been the impetus behind almost all the mandates that we've seen over the last 2 years. It's
It wasn't
very
just
chilling.
Walensky. I mean, so we're talking about early February now. We heard the China lockdowns being praised by the head of the World Health Organization.
Correct. Yeah.
That is,
Tedros.
yeah, Kidros. This is a genius solution. And then,
Yep. And then Aylward, the WHO's representative to China, so one of the other major leaders of the World Health Organization, comes back from China. And this is shortly after China had said that, it reversed their cases. And based on nothing but that, just China saying that, oh, look, our cases reversed a few days ago. He tells the entire world, regardless of population density or economics or really any other factor, he just tells the entire world, you have to do this. You have to start shutting down all of really your entire countries. And that's what happens is that, weeks later, the entire world follows advice. And beginning with Italy, you have this domino effect where the entire world shuts down simply by what the Chinese Communist Party said they did in one city in China. It's absolutely nonsensical sequence of events that is just absolutely horrifying, the destruction that wrought upon the world.
I've been waiting for this interview to fix something that I'm a little confused about. When the first tranche of Fauci emails came out, there was lots of talk back and forth between various officials of the CDC, I believe, or maybe it's the NIH, World Health Organization. Fauci was somehow part of these threads about arranging travel and flights for some delegation to Beijing to learn virus control from the CCP. Fauci didn't go, but I remember just looking, I couldn't quite keep up with what was what. And then I also know from the latest Vanity Fair article that the World Health Organization did in fact send a delegation to China. Is this the same delegation? Is there just one delegation, or were there two, or what's going on there?
I think they've sent multiple, but it was definitely that one in mid-February that, directed. It was the conclusion that they went to China, and the Chinese Communist Party reported their lockdown of Wuhan was so successful that it reversed cases. And based on that, that's what they, that's how that policy got laundered into global policy. And that's why they started directing, leaders all over the world to begin locking down their countries. Why exactly did they do that? I mean, it's very well documented. We know that the World Health Organization is in the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party. That's been written about in the New York Times, in the the Times of London. That's just well known information. It's absolutely horrifying to me that knowing that world leaders around the world have been so, blasé and about taking the advice of the World Health Organization, knowing that they're all stooges for the Chinese Communist Party. It's just utterly bizarre to me that this organization still has so much clout.
Well, I think Twitter banned you. Twitter banned you for violating the terms of
violating, contradicting the commands of the World Health Organization. I mean, utterly, ludicrous Orwellian policy by social media companies to say that, anybody who contradicts the World Health Organization should be censored, knowing that the World Health Organization is, in the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party, stooges for the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it's really a Trojan horse in many ways for, to implement these totalitarian policies that, are dictate so much of life within China. In my mind, the World Health Organization, in many ways, it's used as a kind of front organization. The Chinese Communist Party is the world's largest organized criminal organization. And so if a politician in, let's say, Lombardy or New York City said, I'm going to, implement this policy of lockdown and everybody's rights are suspended, and I might, follow these rules myself. I might not. But, you can't work. You have no more right to a livelihood or to free movement. And based on this policy I got from China, people would say no. I mean, that's downright treasonous. You can't just take this policy from China and implement it in New York City. That is utterly ridiculous. Nobody would buy into that. But when the policy comes through the World Health Organization, even if it's utterly pretextual and nonsensical, the idea that, the Chinese Communist Party told us to reverse their cases. Now you have the World Health Organization saying in a press conference, you have to do this. Now it looks like a legitimate cosmopolitan policy that the same politician in New York can say, oh, it wasn't the Chinese Communist Party that told me to do that. It was World Health Organization that told me to do that. And maybe they are that dumb. I don't know. In some cases, maybe they actually are that gullible. In other cases, perhaps not. But that's how corruption works. Corruption is virtually always a form of playing dumb. I mean, that's how they get away with it. It just has to be plausible enough. The idea that, people saw this as a legitimate policy.
Now, to go back to this delegation issue, how many American officials attended? Do you know? I'm pretty sure we had some representatives of the CDC and the NIH there, although I may be mistaken. Do you know? And we're talking about mid-February, getting on a flight from Washington, D.C., flying to Beijing, sitting at the feet of the masters of lockdowns. I don't know what happens then. Stay in the hotel a couple of nights, hop back on a flight, and announce to your colleagues, "I've seen the future." Do we know how many? And by the way, this is during a time when flights to Beijing and back were banned. So it must have been private jets, right? We're not talking commercial flights here. So do we know? Have you looked into who these officials are? The went and why they were chosen?
Unfortunately, no. I can't say I know the exact details of the delegations that went to China in early 2020. But I can say that the federal government has been, disturbingly far more supportive and far more. The chief officials, public health officials within our federal government have been more inclined to endorse, the Chinese Communist Party's narrative about COVID and endorse it sort of obviously fraudulent data than the general public. They're not very explicit about that because I think they know how, on some level, how ridiculous that is and how ridiculous the public would find it. But, the former Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, Trump's Surgeon General, also tweeted recently, something like 6 months ago, that he believed China's lockdown, China's data was proof of what a strict lockdown in Wuhan could do. So it wasn't just Walensky; it was many of the chief public health officials within their federal government have still cling to this narrative that China's data is still real, that their narrative of having eliminated this virus through the strict lockdown in Wuhan is real.
If the Republicans don't jump on this and starting, the day after the election, they're crazy people.
Yeah.
Now, you remember have you read Scott Atlas's book yet?
I have not.
Okay, you'll enjoy it because you get a very strong impression of how, starting in about November 12th, when Trump locked down travel from Europe, and then the next day, HHS releases not for the public but just for public health officials around the country. Basically, it's a lockdown blueprint.
Yep.
So that's on Friday. Whether Trump knew about that, I don't know. Then you had Fauci and Birx and Kushner spending the weekend in a huddle with Trump, trying to persuade him that we have shut down the economy and for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then we'll drive cases to zero. And we have plenty of records of Trump saying there are 13 cases now, but it's soon going to be zero. So in a funny way, Trump is the first zero COVID guy, Yeah. And then March 16th, a great press conference transcribed at Brownstone in great painful detail. And then the next day, the Nature article comes out saying it's not a lab leak, it's not a lab leak. Mm-hmm. And then 2 weeks later, Trump's like, maybe we should stop destroying people's lives. And they're like, oh no, Mr. President, you've made such progress. If you do that now, we'll just reverse ourselves. We didn't need another 2 weeks, and so on it went. But you gain a real strong sense in reading that. Now, Atlas was not there at the time. He didn't arrive till something like August. But by the time he arrives in August, you get a strong sense of that Trump is no longer president.
Yeah.
That he's welcome to do his press conferences and rallies and greet the Boy Scouts or whatever when they come to the White House or something like this. But that the people running the show was the administrative state.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That power has already kind of transitioned to this global biosecurity state. It's through this sort of, in my mind, what is really from the very beginning a kind of fake emergency. This
remarkable, isn't it? And remarkable the influence that Beijing and the CCP had here, and then basically through the administrative state takes over the country, the better good part of the country for several months, and then really some parts of the country for 2 years. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a 1950s film noir starring Frank Sinatra.
Very sort of quiet coup. I mean, I think there are many questions that remain. How deliberate was this? How carefully planned was this actually? And to what extent was it just this kind of hysteria that overtook people? I mean, you could definitely say that, the Chinese Communist Party decided to shut down a city with this lab in it and create all this theater and, release this pro-lockdown propaganda all over the world. But and everything just kind of after that was just all this, bumbling, groupthink and terror that overtook the world. And so they decided, okay, well, now what do we do about this super virus that's coming into us? And so the entire administrative state just goes on red alert and implements the most, draconian mandates that they could possibly think of, and that's lockdown. And part of that, in some ways, comes from the idea that it worked in Wuhan. Or on the other hand, it's not just this mass hysteria and groupthink. It's actually, this is sort of carefully planned that, working through the administrative state and through the World Health Organization, the Chinese Communist Party would try to export many aspects of its sort of totalitarian system very sort of systematically like that. I don't think it's impossible to say at this point.
Well, Michael, the motive there is there because, I mean, we shouldn't neglect this, and I need to write more about this. But starting in January of 2018, Trump undertook, and by the way, I'm a free trade guy, right? So I'm not like in favor of Trump's trade wars or his attack on China or anything else. I'm not sure. You have a position on that, and we don't even need to discuss it. But the point is that from about 1948 until 2018, the world had generally been on a sort of long run trajectory towards ever lower tariffs and ever less intervention between countries, ever more globalization, internationalization, I would say, of trade. And that was considered the ideal. I guess this is sometimes called the sort of the neoliberal consensus or something like that. That whatever your policies are internally, that's fine. You can have this policy, that policy. But as a world community, we're going to keep the peace through ever more progress towards free trade. So it's a general agreement with tariffs and trade. Then it's the World Health Organization. Tariffs down, 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 down. We've got a judicial body out there ruling for this country, against that country. Come on, everybody, play well. Trump blew all that up using not Congress, but just through the U.S. Trade Representative's office and his pretty much unilateral power. So he starts imposing all these punitive tariffs all over the world, but especially against China. And that, was costly for American consumers, but it's also potentially really destabilizing for China's growth path for the future. So, you can totally imagine that 2 years later, they've had it with this nonsense.
Yep.
And so you have every reason why in a desperate, and not to mention the fact that now you've got the Communist Party of China's interests in getting rid of Trump or punishing him or destabilizing him or somehow punishing him for his wickedness, overlapping now with the U.S. Professional classes who are deeply mortified by Trump.
You'd see that kind of, that kind of unholy alliance there. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think the immediate motivation is there, as well as many indications of sort of long-term modus operandi. It's well documented that Xi Jinping comes from this line of princelings, this ultra hawkish line within the Chinese Communist Party, and seizes absolute power, becomes totalitarian dictator, most powerful leader in China and most terrifying leader in China since Mao Zedong. And it is well documented within his documents that he's issued throughout the party leadership that he doesn't believe that capitalism and communism can exist long term. That one of these systems has to win out, and of course, in his mind, that means global communism. Whether you like it or not, that's the system that he's going to try to take hold around the world. So that long-term motivation to export China's totalitarianism is what they're doing. And the most influential modern strategists within China at this time, within the People's Liberation Army, authored a book called Unrestricted Warfare. And this is essentially, whereas, Xi Jinping's papers are sort of the philosophical basis of, that these ideas of human rights and independent judiciaries and elections, these are all just Western propaganda that contradict, China's hegemony and the world sort of Chinese communist future. That's sort of you can call that the sort of the philosophical basis of it. Unrestricted warfare is kind of the means of how they're willing to do this. And it goes into great detail about how, analog weapons, tanks, planes, boats, are kind of a thing of the past in a nuclear world between nuclear powers. Now we're going to have to rely on, softer things like social media and, disinformation, people's cell phones, things that connect directly to the people, very strong echoes of what we experienced in early 2020. Because at the same time that we are getting this sort of top-down influence about lockdowns, the World Health Organization, stooges for the Chinese Communist Party telling everybody to lock down. You had also, the media. You have the New York Times, a lot of influence there, endorsing this policy of lockdown, shutting out all debate about it. But you also had this very sort of bottom up. You had propaganda going directly to the people, bots just storming everybody's Twitter feeds, saying like, oh, this is what we really should be doing in China. They're having this super lockdown, and here we're just washing our hands, hundreds of thousands of these bots in languages, virtually every language around the world, just storming people's Twitter, advertising this policy of lockdown. So at the same time that you have this sort of policy coming from the top down, you also have it coming from the bottom up. That people think that they thought of this idea of copying China themselves, and that in some ways sort of makes them complicit in it. And so you have the policy coming from sort of both sides, and that's
and then you have Hollywood all the way in, because Hollywood has now this gigantic market in China, and apparently, you're going to make me crazy. Apparently, Hollywood doesn't make any movies that would not get past the China censors. And I'll tell you, and we'll wrap this up, but there's this very interesting movie that I highly recommend to you called Songbird. Mm-hmm. And it was the very first movie made in Hollywood after lockdowns. Yeah. About 6-8 weeks later. And it's an anti-lockdown movie. And it's great. It's a terrifying vision of the future where everybody gets their groceries through a hole in the thing, and they've stayed arrest you if you're infected. And it's vaccine passports. It's just a nightmare. And I love the movie. I think it's just fantastic. But I've not seen any other anti-lockdown movies come out of Hollywood at all since then. Mm-hmm. And if you go to Rotten Tomatoes right now, that movie has something like, a 3% expert approval rating. It's like the most hated movie of all time. It's a wonderful film. Anyway, Michael, you said you'd consider revising or excerpting some of your chapters for Brownstone. I would be thrilled for that. I mean,
absolutely.
It's a chance to promote your book, and also people should get your book and read it. And one of the tragedies of your being taken off Twitter is that there's less chatter about your book now. So, but it's truth telling and shocking, and I would love to help you market it. And I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I think our viewers
Thank you,
are going
Jeffrey.
to be
Likewise.
a little bit amazed to hear this, and very happy to meet you, and I hope to see you again.
I appreciate it. You as well, Jeffrey.
Take care.
You too.